All right, our last session of the day. Thank you all for sticking with us. We've had some excellent presentations, so thank you to all the speakers. Clarissa and Natasha, who we just heard from, are both our co-chairs for the Accessibility Committee of COLE, and they are the ones responsible for helping organize all of this, putting it all together, and their hard work has paid off. So thank you both. Clarissa is our final speaker. You've been hearing from her already in the chat. She is always a rock star in helping to answer questions there. Clarissa is the manager of course development at OU Education Services, and the presentation that we're about to hear is practical strategies to advance accessibility at your institution. Clarissa is, I already said that. I just didn't read it. Sorry about that. I think, oh, and she is also on the University of Oklahoma's Accessibility Compliance Task Force. So thank you, Clarissa. I look forward to hearing your presentation.
I'm very excited to be here and with you all this whole session, and thanks to everyone who's still watching online. No, as Crystal said, it's been a long day. And also hello to those who will be watching this recording later on. So we will be talking today about, oh, sorry, I'm pulling up my slides, about how do we advance accessibility at our institutions? So we've kind of had a lot of discussion today about, what are some specifics with accessibility? So whether that's emails, that's PDFs, that's Microsoft Office, but how can we as individuals address accessibility? So it's a little bit of a step forward in terms of how am I going to apply some of this as well. Um, sorry. Also, I would say too, feel free to stop me if there's any questions that are kind of urgent questions. We'll have time for Q&A at the end as well. And then we do have an activity as well. So in this session, we'll be talking about a framework in terms of layers of influence. So how can we influence ourselves in terms of our knowledge of accessibility courses that we're either involved in or work with, the programs that we're involved in our institution, and also our state and nation as well. So while I say we're going to talk about how we're going to influence things at our institution, all of these really work together as well to really make that change and affect that change. We'll also have an activity, so please stick around for that because it will be related to the assessment as well in terms of how do we apply this framework to our own work on our own lives as well. So, as I mentioned, here's the kind of framework that we'll be using as an organizational structure throughout this presentation. We'll start off with individual and then I work our way up to the nation as well. So post in the chat of those layers of influence. I know we haven't really gone over them yet, but what do you feel most comfortable right now to be able to affect change in, whether that's yourself as an individual, the courses, program you're working with, the institution you work at, maybe that's Oklahoma through Cole or our nation as well. Today I'm seeing a lot of individual courses. Some national ones as well. Programs. I saw some references to also talking with colleagues. Yeah, so there's a lot of really great ways that, and you're welcome to keep posting in the chat. But there's a lot of great ways that we can become involved. And I think part of this session, I just want to help us kind of think of maybe some that we hadn't thought about before, and just create some ideas as well. So starting off with first that kind of micro level, we've got individuals, we have those courses. It sounded like from the chat that this is something that's probably pretty familiar with you in terms of what you're able to influence. So I do hope that there's some here that maybe you haven't thought about yet. So one thing is kind of what you're doing right now, right? So professional development or training. Um, this can also just involve some basic awareness about accessibility. Like no one's expecting people to become like a whole digital accessibility specialist. Really what's important to know, what are those concepts about accessibility? What is it that matters? How does it impact our students or the people that we work with? And there's lots of resources that are available for free. We got some through Cole. We'll talk about that later. But also even things like Oklahoma Able Tech, as Adam was saying earlier. Also, really, I think a passive way to learn, I say that in a positive way, is to sign up for newsletters about accessibility. So, for example, Oklahoma Able Tech has like a monthly newsletter. So that's an easy way to keep yourself up to date on things that are going on in accessibility without you having to like remember to go look for that specific information as well. And so there's a lot of institutions that will have something similar. I would say, for example, I even signed up for the University of Colorado Boulder's newsletter. I'm not associated with them in any form, but they have really good content and it's very universal in terms of accessibility as well. So there are some other things like that that could be of interest. So when we're talking about ourselves as individuals, the important thing here is kind of figuring out where am I at? What do I need to know? And how am I going to stay up to date? I didn't really go into it here, but if you are more of someone who needs to be an advanced user, there are like accessibility certifications. So think of things more like if you're a web developer, that might be something that you want to consider. When we're talking about courses, I would say this is going to be a bit institution specific, but in general, there are accessibility checkers that you could use to, as a starting point, try to figure out, how accessible is my course? How accessible is the files that we're using? So we've talked a lot today about some of those built-in accessibility features, whether that's PDFs, Microsoft Office. We talked about that with emails just before this. And so this can be a really great way to see what I need to pay attention to in those files and in our courses. And as I said, every institution will be a little different because it depends on what learning management system you're using, what types of files are you using, and all of that. And I will say this slide, I'm not saying everyone needs to be using Quality Matters. Um, One thing that's important to keep in mind is that there are quality standards in terms of things like accessibility. So, if your institution's already using something like Quality Matters, this can be a really great resource to consider in terms of there's a whole standard that's devoted to accessibility and how that's a metric of quality online education. So this can be a good resource if you want more of that bird's eye view of is my course accessible? If your institution isn't using something like Quality Matters, there are other rubrics. So I have an example here, the Oscar rubric from SUNY. And in this one, actually, a lot of the standards are related to accessibility as well. So I think that that is something to kind of keep in mind as we're thinking, like, let's say we just built a course, does it meet some of these standards as well? This one's a lot of information. And the main takeaway from this slide, I think, is that when we're designing a course, whether we're an instructor, whether we're an instructional designer or another specialist that's involved, um, we want to be considering accessibility throughout that whole design process. So from the very beginning, are we using accessible tools? What resources are we including in our course? Making sure as we're building things like lectures, course materials, that those are accessible. And then, as we're teaching, is there anything else that I could do to improve this to make my course more accessible as well? We don't want to wait until the last minute and be like, oh no, my whole course is not accessible. So starting early is always better for that as well. So to kind of summarize with the courses, so thinking of some of those accessibility checkers, I didn't really devote a whole slide to it, but also, a lot of things like Microsoft Office have built-in accessible templates. So, for example, if you're using PowerPoint, using the built-in templates is way more accessible than if you were kind of handcrafting some of those slides, including concepts from those quality rubrics, thinking about how you're going to incorporate accessibility into your course design, and also just educating people as well. So whether that's educating your colleagues, educating students as well. So for example, an organization that really focuses on accessibility training for students is like Teach Access. So since accessibility is something that everyone is involved in, it's really important to make sure that others are aware of it as well. So next level, I think there was a few people who touched on this one as well in terms of programs in particular. So we will be talking about programs. We'll talk about um, some suggestions for at an institution scale. When we're talking about programs, if your institution has a more advanced accessibility plugin for their learning management system, this can be a really great way to assess that at scale. So we have an example from Blackboard Ally. And so in this case, it's looked at 10 courses, it's looked at almost 2,000 pieces of content, and there is a 66.3% score for accessibility. So this is something that can, as a whole, tell you um, just about how accessible is my program. Of course, it's all based on AI, so it's not going to tell you everything as if you're manually doing everything, but that can be a good gauge as well, especially here's an example. Um, if you're trying to see how we've improved. So this is one that was shared with me as I collaborated with McLennan Community College that's in Waco, Texas. And so they actually share a digital accessibility tip of the month to their faculty and staff. So in this report, it will say something is like our score for the month is 92% accessibility, which is great. Here's the number of times that students have used alternative formats. Here's how many files we've improved. And then in terms of areas that we still haven't quite gotten where we need to be, like we need to be focusing on increasing font size, for example. And so that's a great way to really know, well, here's where we're at, and maybe here's where we need to be after that. So in terms of program level efforts, kind of tying all of that together, maybe that means requiring a minimum level of accessibility, whether that's program as a whole or in individual courses, or maybe that's saying, here's the number of errors that is okay or not. And then you may also consider accessibility in terms of assessing the quality of that program. And let's say you're a Quality Matters institution, if you are wanting to pursue more certification, well, that means that in general, because your the standards focus on accessibility, the program will be a lot more accessible because it is being assessed with those standards. And also just as we were saying earlier, encouraging others to engage in the accessibility training or also just sharing that awareness as well. I think in general, it's best not to assume that others know about accessibility. And there's always more that we can learn because there's always things changing with accessibility too. So to summarize the program section, in terms of, if you're an instructional designer, if you're a program director, some ways to really think about this is like, how can we shape our program policy to really address accessibility, to include that as a metric? How do we know that our program is accessible and, using some of those metrics that are involved as well? And just how can we embed that culture of accessibility as well? So, in terms of institutions, this is going to be, um, I think, a bit broad in some ways. In general, most institutions have or should have a plan for accessibility. As we're kind of approaching this section, I will say that just because you don't know if there is one doesn't mean that there isn't one. It might be that people are working on it and just haven't necessarily publicized it yet. Um, but I think one thing to keep in mind is, does my institution have one of those committees for ADA Title II or accessibility or a task force? If it doesn't, and it really doesn't, then I think that is something that, maybe you want to bring up to the right parties. But also, if there is such a committee, who is represented on that committee? So, do you have individuals from across campus? Do you have individuals, if there's multiple campuses, do you have someone representing from each of those campuses? And also, do you have faculty involved as well, right? And then for such a committee, what are the goals of this group? What are they trying to accomplish? Because the scale of accessibility is quite big for a whole institution. If there is a committee or task force that is related to this, let's say you're not a member, and it can be really great to give feedback to them and make sure that any concerns that you have are heard as well, or any other suggestions too, so that way people know, here is what the issues are, and they'll consider that as well as they're addressing things. Also, I think it's in general important to know, what are the accessibility policies and procedures of my institution. When we're talking about things like ADA Title II, like, do those need to be revised at all? Is there any of that going on? And so that's something as well that can be involved with such a committee as we were talking about. And this part I will say is more for like if you were involved in one of those committees or might be in the future. But I think the important thing to know is that with something like accessibility on a scale of an institution, there needs to be some metric to find out, are we meeting our needs for accessibility? So this one's from WebAIM, which is a very big organization for accessibility. And I like that it's very simple. So I've included this one. It's got things like leadership vision, commitment to accessibility, planning and implementation, resources and supports, and assessment and continuous improvement. So a few different areas. There are others, which I won't go into a lot of depth, but for example, the World Wide Web Consortium has one. They're the ones who make those web accessibility guidelines. They're also models specific to higher ed too, um, and also those specific to online learning. So when we're talking about institution, sometimes it can feel very big scale, um, and not everyone necessarily will be or needs to be part of such a like task force or committee. But I think it is important to know, does my institution have one, and what does it look like, what are they doing, and how does that affect me as well? So macro level, we got state and nation. So Cole, it's why you're here, actually. So with Cole, or the Council of Online Learning Excellence, we have various volunteer opportunities for accessibility. So that can be a way to also learn more, whether or not you're new to accessibility or more an advanced user. We also have professional development periodically as well. And we'll, as part of the assessment, we'll also be interested in here if there's specific topics that you want to hear more about in the future. Also, in general, we provide resources and state advocacy as well. So I have an example here where we recently have created a memo for faculty and staff guidance on web accessibility. So this particular document just explains in clear language, what is ADA Title II? what is expected of our institutions for accessibility? How does it apply to us? And kind of where do I go if I need to learn more about it as well? And I'll drop it in the chat later on. So really, things like cool, there are others, but I mean, we're here. So are great ways to participate and advance the national conversation as well, and really collaborate with our peers to find out, how do I accomplish this as well? I think, especially with accessibility, there's a lot of specialized questions that we also need to address. And so that's where something like Cole can be really helpful because, maybe you have someone else across the state that has similar subject matter expertise and knows how to accomplish that for accessibility. In terms of the nation, um, there are a lot of different resources. I just included some here that I've been involved in. So, if your institution is an EDUCAUSE institutional member, they do have accessibility community groups. Even, like I would say that one's more technical, but things like their instructional design or online learning community groups also are really great to ask questions about accessibility for advice. For the instructional designers in the room who are interested in accessibility, there is like a Slack community that could be of interest as well. And when we're talking about things like accessibility, um, it's really important to be aware of the different regulations going on. And if there's regulations that are related to accessibility, generally there are public comment periods. So that can be really helpful to have your voice heard there as well. So, for example, when we're talking about ADA Title II in 2023, that's when there was a national comment period for that as well. So, summarizing that with a nation, there's various communities of practice available, lots of mentoring from other institutions. I'm happy to share recommendations. And then we also can add comments about policies as well. So, we are going to switch gears a little bit and work on a brief activity. So, this really aligns with some of the concepts we were talking about. So, in this activity, I'll provide a Google Doc in a second, but the framework that we're using is what are some things that you can control? What are some things that you can influence? And what are some things that you can advocate for? So, I will pull up this Google Doc and drop it in the chat. Okay. And you all got the link properly? I see people showing up. Looks like a yes. So what we're gonna do is you're welcome to either unmute, and if you have ideas, I'll take them down. Otherwise, if you feel more comfortable typing, you can also just type them. And so we'll just go through the different sections together. So first, we'll start off with the things that you can control. So that's things like courses, files, templates. And I think the important thing as we're working through this activity is, tying it back to what, for me personally, can I do for these things? I'll go ahead and zoom in a bit too, in case anyone wants to read. Um, yes, so again, you're welcome to unmute if you want to say things aloud too as well. It is also okay if you'd rather just write them. Seeing lots of great suggestions here in terms of things you can control. So, courses, emails, subscribing to updates from accessibility resources. So, like those newsletters we were talking about earlier, syllabi, that's great. Social media posts, um, professional development emails, announcements. These are really great. Um, Ooh, we already got people on the next one. Well, so we'll transition to the next one. So, what are some things you can influence? So this might be team processes, maybe it's your colleagues, maybe it's whether or not we use a particular tool or technology. A lot of great ones again. We've got helping others in their office and encouraging them in terms of accessibility, providing training, assistance, encouraging professional development. Great one in terms of department procedures for content creation, um, awareness, like the plus one. I would also say for anyone who's adding things in the chat, I'll also add those after this as well. So now we'll move on to the next section, which is potentially the hardest one, I will admit. So what are some things that you can advocate for? So, and this can be on whichever level that you feel comfortable with. So maybe that's your institution, maybe that's the program that you're involved in, or maybe it's not even like leadership decisions of your institution, but it's like your boss's decisions or things. Or maybe that's your involvement with coal. Lots of great suggestions. What was the first one? Let's just item. Um, for support in making courses more accessible, um, accessible signage, accessibility regarding vendors, environmental factors, funding for accessibility. That's a great one. Captioning is unfortunately expensive. um, Making sure the school website's ADA compliant, organization habits, the culture and atmosphere. So these were all really great, and I think that you're welcome to add more later on if you think about them too as inspiration. So I also say that you're welcome to use this as a resource as you're filling out the assessment for today. Um, Keep in mind the important thing here is, how am I going to get involved in this? Whether it's, small scale or large scale. Um, I think that sometimes we don't take that step back to think about, okay, what am I going to do next? So that is all that I have. So I'm happy to answer any questions. Let's see. See a question about QM. So I would say for QM, that one I think would be a good question to specifically ask the QM instructional designers association and just see if they have suggestions on that. I think I attended a meeting a while ago and um, very lively conversation with everyone. So I'm sure that they would be interested in saying something about that. Besides that, QM also does have like an accessibility resource course that could be helpful to pull things from there as well. Any other questions? Alrighty. If they come up later on, you're also welcome to email me. I'm going to drop it in the chat. Yeah, there we go. And you also have the Google Doc as a resource when we share out the handouts and everything. So with that, I will hand it back to Christella or whoever, if it's not Christella.
No, thank you. Great job as always. And this concludes our session. So thank you everyone for attending.